Hello and welcome to the Dyson Leadership Podcast. I'm joined by someone that I got to meet last year, and it's been a great connection to have. Looking forward to having him on for the podcast today. His name is Derick Dickens. So, Derick is a fellow alumni of Liberty University, which is kind of how we have that initial connection. And we spoke at a virtual conference, and I completely enjoyed his presentation, hearing him speak. And when I was lining up guests for the podcast, reached out to Derick to see if he would be willing to jump onto a podcast episode because, funny enough, he's in the consulting industry, training industry, doing lots of leadership training, personal development kind of things, all kinds of great stuff, which hopefully we'll get to share and talk about a little bit of that today. So, Derick, do you want to go ahead and say hello to our podcast listeners today?
Good to be here, Nick, and good welcome, podcast listeners. Good to be here and to talk to you about things that I'm passionate about.
Absolutely. So, Derick, I want to give you just a moment before we dive into our topics for today. I know we've got several things we're going to talk through. Do you want to share just a little bit about the kind of work you've done in the past, a little bit about who you are? I know you've spoken at a lot of different events, conferences. Just a second for you to kind of share a little bit from your perspective about who you are.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I'm the father of three wonderful kids who are all grown up and are all in their careers, which I'm really excited about. That's very important to me. But also about me is, I'm in leadership development, training development, and organizational development. I tell people that I make better employees, better leaders, and better organizations that are engaging and propel success at many different levels, not just the human side and also the proficiency side. So I kind of work with organizations like Dish Network, J. Crew, things you've heard of. I've also been in the financial industry and also consulted for different other organizations and taught at different schools around to mark my passion and desires. I'd say I get the most passion out of helping people be successful in whatever role they're given. And really, I love the human side of that element. I love making sure that we can engage as leaders, the people who we are around, not just the people who report to us, but people who are our peers or even our bosses. So that's my passion in life.
That's great. And I know me and you both, we do leadership training, different areas. One of the things that I love about having different leadership trainings and connections with people that do training and consulting is we have very similar passions, but we also have very separate niche markets. And so people focus on different priorities, different things. And our first topic that we're kind of going to cover is a little bit more in my niche market, what I do in my area that I operate in. And that is the topic, everyday leadership. So for me, I hear everyday leadership and I think of just leading every day. For me, I equate it more to self-leadership and being a kind of person that embodies leadership principles. And so that's something I teach a lot to different individuals I work with, is the idea of self-leadership and living a life of leadership. So I'm curious to get your thoughts, your perspective when we're talking about everyday leadership. What is your definition of everyday leadership?
I think you wrapped it up really good. It is seeing yourself as a leader in every aspect of life. You have seen the great business leaders who are successful in business, but outside of business, they're horrible leaders. They do a horrible job. They're not effective at all. And I could mention names that everyone would know, and they would say, yeah, that person really was not that good of a leader outside of the business realm. And when I talk about everyday leadership, is that we don't just hang up our leadership jacket when we walk out the door, that we're always looking for leadership opportunities to impact, to serve, to work in whatever it happens, whether it's at a family reunion or whether it's at coaching a softball team or whether it's at work and you're negotiating a multi-million-dollar contract. All of those require leadership. And I'm thinking everyday leaders. But here's the key I want to get out of this. I said, we all know some great business leaders. But one of these things that have helped me is I was one time reading about Michael Jordan. And you know who Michael Jordan is, the great basketball player. And he asked, who is the person who's been the most influential on you? And he said his father. And now his father didn't teach Michael Jordan how to be a great basketball player. But the leadership aspects that his father had on him, in fact, Michael Jordan called him the Rock. The leadership aspects that he had on Michael Jordan helped him become a great basketball player. And if it wasn't for his father, he wouldn't be where he is today. That's what I'm talking about for great everyday leader, is people who influenced all the people around them on everyday things. He may not influence you on your place of business, but without them, you wouldn't be as successful as you are in your place of business. And I think I'm always looking for those stories of people who are these great everyday leaders that I say, they influenced a remarkable number of people, but in something totally different and than what those other people were influenced in.
Yeah, that's so good. And as you're talking, I'm thinking through people in my life, whether it's, for me, I'm in the business world. I have business degrees, teach business classes, do leadership training, all of that. I'm very much invested into the business world. And I think of both of my parents in that instance and lessons they taught me growing up and things they taught me about being a good person, treating people right, all of the Christian values that I have, kind of helping me learn and navigate all of those. But yet they're not business-minded people. And so they impacted an element of my life that shaped my core values and some of my character. But then that character and those values translate over into my career and what I'm doing long term. And so that comes to mind. I think even of a good friend of mine who challenges me and pushes me on different aspects of being better from a health and fitness perspective, where not everybody in my family has that kind of focus. Not all of my friends have that kind of focus, but that's one area he pushes me and challenges me to become better. And that even in that sense, that's an everyday leader in a certain aspect.
And we need those types of leaders in our lives. And so I go back to you. It's easy to go to our parents. And I think the studies show that people who have stable family situations, they actually do better in leadership in life. So I think there's a correlation that we could say that, generally speaking, if you want to be a great leader, you're going to have people gather around you. Now, my mom was raised in an orphanage. She didn't have a mother or father. She had actually nuns and priests who took care of her in a Catholic orphanage in New York. And so, but she was at the same time had people who came alongside of her after she grew up to help her improve and things like that. There's a lady I have right now, and I actually was visiting my dad recently, and this lady is 84 years old. So well beyond her retirement years. She influenced my dad during a really hard time in his life, influenced a lot of people. And I sat down with her for 2 hours at her house and just sitting and talking to her. And I've known her for over 40 years. And so for over 40 years, she's been influencing me, and I've been sitting down and listening to her and talk to me, and she's been engaging in me. She's an everyday leader. And she is somebody who continues to influence wherever they are. And she does it with grace. She does it with mercy. She doesn't do it with a heavy hand. And yet I know everyone in my family, my brother, sister, myself, my dad, all look at this lady and say, wow, let me tell you how much she has influenced us. That's the kind of everyday leader we have. And I think we all need those. And one of the challenges I tell people is you need to find those everyday leaders, write them down. They could be younger than you. They could be older than you. They could be the same age as you. But you need to find those people to say, who are these people who impact me every single day to improve me? And develop those relationships. So when I went back home, I was like, okay, I got to make sure I spend that time with her. And she's had me speak at events and things like that in the past. But I wanted to make sure I spent time with her because her influence on me is that remarkable.
That's great. And I love when people have instances like that, because a mentor or somebody who is, in this instance, an everyday leader that truly impacts you, interacts with you, not everybody has that, and not everybody seeks that out or seeks to develop those relationships. I think that's something everybody can benefit from when you identify who those people are, and then you spend more time in there, you invest in those relationships. And I know for me, one thing that I've always told people in my leadership training, I do a lot of classes. One thing that I always tell them, that I'm not going to teach something to them if I don't live it out or fully believe it personally. But then also I tell them that I don't want to be somebody that you see here telling you one thing or one way to act, and then you find me different somewhere else. And I think that's a big characteristic of the everyday leaders, is they're not different in the different areas that you see them. They're not one person when you see them at work. They're not another when you see them at church, and they're not another when you pass them at the grocery store. Their character, their values are exactly who they are everywhere you interact with them. And that's what makes those people special. They're genuine, they're authentic, but they also care about the people they interact with. And I think that from your example, that's exactly the kind of person you're talking about.
Yeah, and Nick, let me just say, you get close enough to anybody, you're going to see some hypocrisy in them. I mean, just the reality is you are going to see that. But the whole goal is that we don't want to be hypocritical. And this is timely because I had a conversation with my daughter last night, and I'd done something a couple months ago, and she says, "Dad, that was hypocritical." And she's very close to me, and I just, yeah, Casey, you're right. I probably shouldn't have done it that way. But the cool thing is that she told me. And the cool thing is that we had that conversation, and she's like, "Dad, I just don't think you should have done it that way. That doesn't show what you've always taught us as kids." And I said, "You're right. It doesn't. It's not healthy. It's not good." But that's the whole design is leaders in developing themselves, they will see areas of hypocrisy. And everyday leaders will see areas of hypocrisy. But the difference between leaders and non-leaders is leaders look at that and say, "That's an opportunity for me to grow. I see that area of hypocrisy, and I can grow in that area of hypocrisy by getting rid of that and figuring out why did I do that and rectify it." So when I was talking to my daughter, I was like, "Yeah, you caught me. I am not going to do that again." And you're right. And it wasn't against her. I didn't need to apologize to her, but it was something that she does as impactful there. So, and that's what everyday leaders do. Everyday leaders looks at this, but not only that, everyday leaders foster an understanding that when they walk into any situation, they are leading, and they look at how they can serve their fellow man or man or woman. They look at how they can serve a lot of people in around them, and they try to find what leadership style fits best for them at the time. And sometimes that could be, "Hey, I just need to make a meal for someone and take it to them." And other times it could be, "I'm sitting with them." I think another characteristic that leaders do is that they make people feel like they're important. And one of the great compliments I've had is a lady a few months ago told me, she says, "Derick, when people are around you, they feel like they're important. They feel seen." And I've never told her to say that. This was someone from church. And I stepped back and I was like, that is one of the best compliments someone has ever given me. Because what that says is that I'm not there about myself. I do try to make sure I'm connecting with people and things like that. And so often we get into those realms where people don't interact or they ignore people, and they don't do it purposefully. It just happenstances. But leaders first start with understanding who's around them and making them feel important around them.
Absolutely. And that's one thing I've noticed as well, kind of touching on the hypocrisy side of it, where even for me, I may tell somebody something, but if I fall short, because we're human, we make mistakes, I realize it and say, okay, or somebody points it out, okay, how can I get better? And I think that's a key thing that a lot of leaders do, is asking themselves, how can I get better? I made a mistake. How can I avoid it next time? I fell short. How can I achieve the goal next time? Always looking for that improvement and something better. So something you've mentioned a couple times is talking about learning. And I know that's part of what our rest of our conversation is going to. So I do kind of want to segue over into that and kind of a bridge to get there for people who are wanting to become everyday leaders. I know the common things that people are told is, go to a leadership seminar, go read a leadership book, find a leadership podcast, listen to it. Like, there's so many different things that people will get told. And I know you've kind of looked at some research on learning styles, and some people may have a preference one way or another. Some people learn what the saying has always been is people learn one way as kind of a primary way. So how about you share a little bit about the learning styles and some of that information that you've come across?
Yeah. So the traditional way people say they learn is that you have three different learning styles: auditory, kinesthetic, and visual. And everyone you've probably taken those tests, and some people have added different ones like social and things like that. And you take those tests and you find out your primary learning style. But when you're doing the research on this, actuality, those learning styles are somewhat of a myth. And I say somewhat because there's a little bit of a grain of truth in it. So I'm generally more of an auditory person. And so I do apply more to the auditory. But in training and development, the studies actually shows everyone learns better when all three are utilized in training. So I may be auditory, but doesn't mean that I can't learn with visual, auditory, and kinesthetic skills. I learn because all of those are incorporated, and it shows that. And I'm just if you are at a low level, if you get a higher level with auditory, if you add all three, you could almost at times double the amount of learning that you do with a visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And if you add all three of them. And so what I try to do in training seminars and what I try to do in other learning capacities is saying, okay, how do we fit all three of them in? How do we stop learning? So there's a lot of times I'm looking at, I'll add another element, and the kinesthetic is one, but I do a lot of situational things, and I have people talk it through. So I add a lot of social elements to it as well. And when you do all three, you learn better. You may not be a visual person, but the visual helps you to be even better than you would if you just had your primary style there.
Absolutely. One thing that I've started doing in my training, and it sounds somewhat similar to maybe what you're doing as well, but instead of the traditional, hey, we're going to have this presentation, the speaker's got a PowerPoint, they're going to go through slides and information and lecture or teach. There's a lot of people, yes, they can learn in that way, but there's a lot of people that kind of tune out, and that's not really what they're focused on. What I've come across is Dr. Tim Elmore, who's someone who's wrote a lot of books specifically for youth and youth leadership development, but he expressed how there's a need for visual. And so he started focusing heavy on visual. As I'm researching and going through, I get to notice there's the interest in hands-on or an exercise or an activity. And so it's the realization that no one thing is the one size fits all, that you could do a PowerPoint presentation, people could learn, but could they learn better if you do a PowerPoint, but then also mix in pictures that paint a word picture, and you can describe how this picture relates to the topic and kind of tell a story as you're going through. But then what if you do the PowerPoint, you talk, you have the picture, you build a word picture and a story, and then you add an exercise at the end of it to get the hands-on and get the people engaged. And what I found is in those settings, when you can incorporate all of those different things, that you always engage people, but it also mixes it up to where, lack of a better way of putting it, it breaks the dullness, or where people might start to gloss over in the training and they start to become more engaged. The thought that just came to mind as I'm thinking through this, I wonder how many times in business, if we started incorporating these types of strategies where it's not just a regular training session of here's the hands-on, this is how you do it, or here's a PowerPoint, flip through this PowerPoint and it will tell you how to do something. If we start to incorporate these multiple elements into just workplace training for how to do tasks and processes, how much that would truly impact and improve training of employees on the job. That's a thought that just came to mind as we're talking.
Well, you look at Apple, Apple, Mac, and if you ever have those things, and back in the 90s, early 2000s, if you looked, you could take a package of something from Microsoft, and you take a package of something from Apple. Microsoft had all this writing on it. Apple was very simple, clean, neat, and it was more intuitive. And who was, I mean, I'll say I have a bias on who was better on that. And the reason why is in training, what we sometimes have these big things that we want to do that are very complex. But sometimes it is more simpler, visually appealing, those kinds of things that attract us. And so spending a little bit of time on that. I hired an intern one year for a summer, and I gave her all my training material. This has been about 10, 15 years ago. And I handed her all my training material, and I said, I want you to make it look pretty. And because I'm okay with designing things, but I'm not the greatest designer in the world as far as putting these things together. And I've gotten better through the years, but I hired her and she did a phenomenal job and an amazing job. And I did notice just that little thing changed the dynamics of my training classes in the future. She was able to go right in there and do it. And she's now, I mean, she was she was a Liberty student as well. And she went on, she's doing some great things. I keep track of her, where she's at. But it is one of those things that, if you invest in those areas, it really does help. We are training, when we are in front of people, we have an entire package. It's not just our voice that people are looking at. It's not how we inflect. It's our visuals. It's everything else that it has. It's how we project our voice. It's the activities that we do. And all those are vitally important in training.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we start to get into these different elements of the training styles or learning styles, I think when we engage people both in what maybe their preference is, but still giving these other areas, I think it truly makes a bigger impact on training and development. And I know for me in my career, both professionally and doing leadership training, I'm in front of a lot of people on a regular basis, and hearing what you're saying, as well as some of the things that I've experienced and learned, it's really challenged me on my philosophy, because when I started my career, it was very much just create a PowerPoint, put screenshots of things, and that's it, hand it to somebody, and that's their training. And on occasion, you might have an in-person presentation. Like that. It was just very dry in that regards. And even the same in leadership training. A lot of leadership training that I had sit through and been through was not very interactive. It was very dry. Here's a lecture. This is what you do. This is how you do it. Or on the flip side, it was nothing but interactive, but there wasn't anything you could take notes on or really take home with you. It was just the experience and the moment of, this is what I've done. So I know that was kind of a challenge to my perspective. And I think that's a big thing we've got to get past, is the mindset of this is the only way we learn, or this is the only way we train people, just to break out of that stigma.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned two things here. Is one, in the training classes, a lot of things that we could be doing. And I think you mentioned those things, is better graphics, how we use our voice, how do we use audio, how do we use kinesthetic. By the way, on that, I used to tell people in leadership training, every 8 minutes, our training should be doing something. And I have a quote that I used to tell my people: the person talking is the person learning. And I love interaction. And so I incorporate a lot of talking and people getting back to it. But I also really focused in on what happens outside of the training class too. And I think the studies really do show that if you just go to a training class, nothing's going to happen. We spend a lot of money on training classes, and you and I make our money in training classes. I mean, we are not against training classes. I love them. I think they're very good. And I think this circles right back to everyday leaders. You need that. They develop a base and a foundation for what they have. But the studies show that roughly around 10% of the learning actually occurs in training classes. I didn't learn to ride a bike in a training class. I learned to ride a bike by getting out there on there. You can't learn to be a leader in a training class necessarily. You can get some foundational elements. You can learn some safety. You can learn some things that are important and how to engage properly or think things through differently. But actually, what you do outside of the training class is really going to be immeasurable. And the data, and I'll say this, the data here is 10% of learning actually occurs in class. Now, these are fudgeable numbers. These aren't accurate. A lot of academic articles say it's not really 10%, it's 8%. And we're using round numbers to make a point, not using round numbers because it's there. But 20% of our learning occurs with mentors, people who are everyday leaders. And so when I wanted to be a good public speaker, I didn't read about public speaking, and I just didn't go watch great speeches on YouTube. I actually found me a mentor named Mike, and Mike helped develop me, and he listened to me, and he says, "Derick, don't do this ever again. That sucks." And he says, "Oh no, time out." And we were working through it, and it was that mentorship that he had with me. And I had many mentors, not just him. He was the biggest one. He was the one that was most important. But that actually helps you grow even more. And so when I tell people, when I'm trying to design a leadership program, what I'm trying to do is say, okay, what is the 10% we're trying to do? And then how do we get them in a place where they can get evaluated, they can be helped, they can be mentored? And that's just 30% of how you do it. And then the next 70% is just doing it constantly. I say, if you want to be great at public speaking, go to a class, get mentored, and do a lot of it. And if you keep doing a lot of it, you're going to get better naturally. You're going to get feedback. You're going to learn what, that didn't work, that worked, and things like that. And that makes up all of learning. And leadership is the same way. You want to learn how to be a great leader, take a good class, get a good mentor to help you through that class, and then go and do a lot of it and keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. And as a leader, as a manager, I want my people, and when they come to me, and oftentimes I'll get this request, I want to go to this class. Oh, I want you to go to that class too. It's a great class. What are you going to do afterwards? That's my first question. And I don't just stop. You're going to go to a class. No, you're going to have to do the 20% and the 70% of this. And how are we going to do this? Because I'm not going to send you to a class because it's going to be ineffective if you just go there and come. And we design these things around that type of model that we do.
That's great. And I have a couple thoughts as you're talking, and the public speaking resonates with me. I started public speaking at 16 years old. And so I completely understand where you're coming from. That's very applicable to me and what I experienced. I remember recently I guess it was about a year ago, something like that I spoke in front of my new church, and there was an opportunity. I was getting up and I was speaking in front of the church. And I remember there was a few people that looked at me and they go, well, we always thought you were more quiet. You are a very great public speaker. Like, you didn't seem nervous. You didn't stumble over your words. You didn't have this and that. Like, you seemed very confident up there. But what they didn't realize is I had been to a public speaking class in my college time. I had been through public speaking training in high school. But there was the issue too of they hadn't seen the hundreds of times that I had been up in front of groups and classes and events and peer groups and all of these different instances where I've spoken in front of people, where now I don't get nervous or anxious in that way. And I'm very confident as a public speaker, but it took those hundreds of times and years of practice to get to that point. And a lot of people don't realize the consistency and what goes into that kind of thing. Another thought that came to mind just as you're going through that as well, just thinking of people who are goal setters. And you were talking about 70% is what happens outside of a classroom or a training session. I think back to the statistic, and I love to use it in different instances, but I believe it's somewhere along the lines of near 80% of New Year's resolutions are gone by the end of January. And it's a lot of what gets people in that instance is they have the good intentions. It's the same. A lot of people take classes, they have the good intentions, but they don't take that and actually apply it and use it consistently, and it just goes away. So more than anything for people, it's what you do consistently day in and day out.
Yeah, it is. I would agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why I tell people don't set a lot of goals. I think one of the challenges we do is we set too many goals and we don't accomplish any. And I think that's what happens to New Year's resolutions is we have so much on our plate. And then we have to be purposeful in the goals that we do. And I think there's a type of person who, when they do succeed on the New Year's resolutions, why do they succeed? And they literally redesign their day around whatever their goal is, and they make sure that all the days are doing that. And when they get off track, they get right back on there. But public speaking resonates with me too, because first of all, I don't know anyone who in their first time public speaking is a good public speaker. No. I've never seen that. I have a friend, and he actually just passed away in February, and he heard me public speak years ago, and he said, Derick, you should never make a living public speaking. You're horrible. And so what I did is that's when I got Mike Harbor. I got a whole bunch of people around me, and I just spoke anywhere anyone wanted to speak. I won all these awards. I was doing really well. And I thanked Randy. I said, if you didn't give me that feedback, I would have never have been wanting to prove you so wrong in my life. And I went out after that. And that is what the 70-20-10 is yes, he could have told me you could improve this, you can improve that, you can improve this, but I had to do it. And I said at one point, and to the point, I even do this to certain nonprofits. I don't care if you pay me, just let me come and speak. And I used to, anybody who called me up and says, hey, could you speak on this topic? I said, I'll be there. I was speaking, sometimes I was speaking 5 days a week and loved it and doing a lot of it for charity. I mean, it was not something there, but because what I wanted to do is I wanted to get really good at something. And that helped me become really good at it. Now, you don't need that type of force, but I really did want to be where I'm at today. I didn't want to give up on my dream And so when my friend Randy gave me that information, I was like, well, I need to change that. And I did. And he years later said, well, I gave you bad advice. I said, it was bad advice, a bad counsel. I said, it was bad counsel, but it was the right thing I needed to hear at the time. And sometimes we get those and we can turn those into lemonade.
Yeah, absolutely. So Derick, we are quickly approaching kind of the end of our time as far as the podcast episode. We've got a couple final questions that I want to hit you with and let you kind of run with on the spot here. So first off, I'm a firm believer in leaders are readers, that all of us, we're going to find good books, whether they're audiobooks, physical books, reading through, or something along those lines. We're going to study. So what's maybe a couple books that you've read that's really marked your life, or that you would recommend out for our listeners as key books they should check out?
Yeah. I love the book. So I love Kusas and Posner's Leadership Challenge. I think that's just kind of a must read. If you haven't read that you really need to read that book. It is a mainstay in my library. I have that, and I refer to it. First, I've read through it 3 or 4 times, but now I refer to it as, okay, let me revisit that concept and do that. It has totally transformed, I think, the leadership development realm. Another book that I have and that I really like is Turn the Ship Around. And that is just a phenomenal book. If you've ever read about a guy who turned the worst submarine vessel in the United States Navy to becoming the best, and how they did it and what they did. And you will, as I read through there, I look at everything I've ever done wrong and get really embarrassed that of all this bad stuff that I've done. And he has a companion book. It says Leadership is Communication, I believe is the name of it, which is also a really good book. And then I always do believe that we learn. So I love those kinds of things, but I also think we learn leadership from fiction. I think that some of the best things you can read is fiction to help you understand leadership. And my go-to almost every single time, if you ask me, is Lord of the Rings. And there, my favorite character, the best character in the whole wide book series is Samwise Gamgee, who I believe sacrificed and was a servant leader to Frodo to making sure that the ring gets destroyed. And he sacrificed everything about himself to make Frodo successful. Samwise is my hero in that book. And I read and I get something out of that I read the book at least every 2 years. And I get something out of that book every single time that can help me in leadership. I think great leaders need to be more engaged in fiction. We learn a lot more about life than we do just from the fiction books that we have. And so Lord of the Rings is a must read.
That's a great observation. And I love that, because I'm a big fan of reading in general, whether it's science fiction. There's a lot of those things that I enjoy as well. So for the podcast listeners, if you want to check out any of those books, I'm going to list them in the description. Whether you're on YouTube or a podcast platform, check out the description, find out the names of those books, links to them. Derick, one other question for you as we're wrapping up. If there is one key point of advice that you would pass along to maybe young leaders, aspiring leaders, or those that may be listening to our podcast, what's one bit of wisdom that you would put out as a key point of wisdom for us?
It's the area I failed at the most when I was younger, and that was humility. Start working on that humility. Pride will destroy you. Pride will tear you up. A humble leader is the best type of leader we could have. And I say that not from someone who mastered it or still has mastered it. But I will tell you that was my Achilles heel as a younger kid. And so when I see humility, it actually attracts me more to people who are humble. Practice humility. That's
some great advice. So, Derick, if it's all right with you, I'm going to list your LinkedIn in the description for the video podcast as well, in case somebody wants to connect with you, reach out. Maybe they want to have you come speak at an event or just follow along with you. Is there anything else that you have, or any other way that somebody might want to connect with you, or is LinkedIn the best?
LinkedIn right now is the best, and
Okay.
please, I'm open to connect. So if you actually send a request, I'll always connect with you. I love connecting with people on LinkedIn, and let's talk. And always would have a virtual coffee if you ever wanted to. So
Absolutely. Well, hopefully some people reach out and connect with you, because I know you're a great resource, a great person to be connected to, and I'm glad our paths crossed for sure, to be able to meet and connect and chat. And it's been a great handful of times we've gotten to interact. It's been a pleasure. Well, for our
thank you, Nick,
podcast,
as well. I appreciate being here.
yeah. So for our podcast, I think that's going to wrap up our time for today. I want to thank you all for listening for this podcast. If you enjoyed this, please be sure to like, subscribe, leave us a rating wherever you are listening or watching this podcast. That really helps us out. Be sure to share this out. If you know somebody that could get value from this podcast, share it with your networks on social media, tag me in it, and I'll be sure to give you a shout out as well if you do. But help us grow this podcast. That way we can add value to others. And as kind of the motto for my business, the tagline, we look to unlock people's leadership. It's through conversations, podcast, and just engaging content for you. Hope you join me again and come back next week for another episode of the Dyson Leadership Podcast.